This is a haunting memory from 5 years ago, when I was just 9. Back then, my family loved to snack on chips, and we were lucky to have a small shop right in front of our house. It was owned by an older woman we called Mrs. May. She must have been in her 60s, with a kind face and gentle eyes that crinkled whenever she smiled. She had a daughter and lived in a tiny home just behind the shop. Mrs. May was my favorite because she always slipped me a free lollipop after every purchase, and I'd light up every time I saw her. The last time I saw Mrs. May was during our summer vacation visit to my home country, right before the pandemic began. After that, due to lockdowns and restrictions, I couldn't visit for nearly 3 years. But last year, my cousins traveled to visit us from my home country, and I couldn't resist asking about Mrs. May. Strangely, every time I brought her up, my cousin would fall silent or try to change the topic, like she didn't want to talk about her. It got to the point where I kept asking over and over until she finally broke down and said, "Fine, if you really want to know, I'll tell you what happened." Then she began her story, and as she spoke, I felt a chill creeping down my spine. She explained that, shortly after my last visit, Mrs. May had suffered a severe brain injury. It left her paralyzed, forcing her to shut down her beloved shop. It was a painful time for the community, especially for those of us who had come to love her so much. About a year later, everyone heard she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. My cousin paused, as if uncertain about continuing, and then, with a shudder, she began recounting the strange events that happened after Mrs. May's passing. One quiet afternoon, my aunt was home alone when she heard a faint knock at the door. Thinking it was a neighbor, she casually opened it, only to freeze in shock. Standing on the doorstep was Mrs. May. She was dressed in a traditional Indian sari, clutching an old, rusty brown bag, her gaze fixed and distant. My aunt stuttered, "And Mrs. May? How can I help you?" Mrs. May's eyes bore into my aunt, and although my aunt offered to hold the heavy-looking bag for her, Mrs. May clutched it tightly, her face twisting with anger. Her refusal grew louder, her voice trembling with an almost feral intensity, until she finally snarled, "No." Her eyes gleamed a shade of unnatural red, and she stamped her foot with such force that my aunt stumbled back. And then, in a low, husky voice, she whispered, "Tell Mr. Philip the first want to take him to the graveyard." Mr. Philip was my grandfather, who was at the dinner table in the next room, oblivious to the eerie scene unfolding by the door. My aunt, shaken, tried to explain that my grandfather was busy. But Mrs. May's voice grew louder, more insistent, and almost otherworldly as she repeated, "Tell Mr. Philip the first want to take him to the graveyard." Over and over, her voice rising until it was a raspy shout, each word vibrating with fury. My aunt was terrified but tried to shut the door in panic. However, Mrs. May's hand shot out, stopping it mid-close, seemingly unharmed by the heavy door pressing against her hand. She slowly pushed the door back open and leaned in, her face inches from my aunt's, and let out a spine-chilling scream, "Tell Mr. Philip the first want to take him to the graveyard." At this point, my aunt's gaze dropped to Mrs. May's rusty brown bag. A sickening sight greeted her, a dark liquid was seeping out, dripping slowly onto the ground. It was unmistakably blood. Paralyzed with terror, she tried to make sense of what she was seeing, but every instinct was screaming at her to shut the door and lock it. Summoning every ounce of strength, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart racing. From inside, she could hear Mrs. May's faint muttering, her voice like a sinister lullaby, punctuated by soft knocks against the window. She paced outside, peering in with that eerie red glow in her eyes, her face twisted into a wide, sinister grin. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a cold, unsettling silence. After that day, no one ever saw Mrs. May again. It was as if she had vanished from existence, her presence a ghastly memory that no one dared to acknowledge. My aunt never spoke of the incident, but every so often, I wonder what might have happened if my grandfather had gone with her that night, to the graveyard she so desperately wanted him to visit. To this day, I still feel a chill thinking about Mrs. May, her haunting gaze, and that rusty brown bag dripping with blood. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button. Join us for more spine-tingling tales and thrilling mysteries. Your support helps us bring you the best in horror storytelling. Subscribe now so you never miss out on our next terrifying story.